Welcome to Anti-Tank Chats. In this series, we will take you through the history of infantry anti-tank weapons. In this episode, we will be looking at the development of the World War II single-use recoilless anti-tank projector known as the Panzerfaust.
Please remember to like, subscribe or click the little notification bell if you don't want to miss out on these videos. And I'd just like to say thank you to all our patrons for making this possible. Please join them if you can.
It's early September 1944. C Squadron, the Sherwood Rangers, part of 30 Corps, have just pushed into Geel, Belgium. For Second Lieutenant Stuart Mills, the threat of Panzerfaust has become all too real. Writing in his memoir, By Tank into Normandy, Stuart recalls the moment and the fear of having just seen Captain McWilliam's tank brewed up by what he believes is a Panzerfaust. My mind was full of horrors. I had seen at the closest possible range what had happened to Jimmy, and now it was very likely that the same thing would happen to me. Here I was sitting in my Sherman with all its firepower, but I could not identify any target or even guess the direction I should be looking. Sure enough, about 2 minutes later, there was a terrific sheet of flame and shower of sparks as we were hit. We fired the Browning machine gun in what we thought was the direction of the shot and backed furiously, if rather clumsily, into the main square. Thankful to be able to move at all, a piece of shrapnel had grazed my forehead and taken my beret with it. But that was the extent of the damage to any of us. My driver, Bog Ingle, said that he had seen a German infantryman 10 yards away a second before firing his Panzerfaust and had felt the blast against his legs. I later found that half a track plate had been shot away on our starboard side and that a hole had been punched right through the sprocket assembly into the differential. If we had a co-driver that day, he would have been killed, or at least had lost his legs. Stuart's evocative account brings home the fear and the anxiety that the German Panzerfaust would hold for tank crews in the coming months until the end of the war. But before we examine how serious a threat to tanks the Panzerfaust posed, it's worth examining how the Germans developed the weapon in the first place. Germany, like Britain and the US, had by 1942 reached the same conclusions, that their anti-tank rifle, in their case the Panzerbuchse 39, was outdated. As was explored in the previous episode on the bazooka, the Germans had already played a significant role in the development of the shaped charge, going back to the 1880s. However, by the late 1930s, it was the pioneering work of an Austrian, Dr. Franz Tomanek, employed by the Luftwaffe's Aeronautical Research Institute, who had played the lead role in Germany's shaped charge development. And it was his wartime work which led to the development of the 3-kilogram magnetic hand-placed shaped charge grenade, the HH3, which was first issued to troops on the Eastern Front in May 1942, and over 500,000 would be produced before production was ended. But again, the Germans, like the British and Americans, faced a similar issue. It was one thing to develop the shaped charge, it was another to deliver it to the target. For the Germans, the HH3 was effective, but it basically required a heroic act, through stealth or charging, just to place it on an AFV. Early solutions to the delivery problem saw the Germans develop a thrown anti-tank mine, Panzerwerfer mine, which deployed cloth fins to stabilise it in flight, and rifle anti-tank grenades were developed from 1940 onwards. These could be later fired from a modified Panzerbuchse 39. Even before the deployment of the HH3 on the battlefield, in April 1942, the German Army Ordnance Department were aware that they needed a better infantry anti-tank weapon and put out a requirement to the German ordnance industry. It's at this point that Dr. Heinrich Langweiler, working for the Hugo Schneider Works in Leipzig, enters the story. Langweiler had proposed a shaped charge weapon called a Faustpatron, fist projectile, named for the fact that it could be carried in one hand. Known by its in-house design name as the FP 8001 and in service use as the Faustpatron 43, the weapon was certainly light, consisting of an 1 kilogram, 80mm diameter shaped charge warhead attached to a recoilless projector tube. The recoilless tube used black powder propellant to launch the warhead forwards, and a counteracting amount of propellant was forced out of the rear of the tube to eliminate any recoil from the weapon. Initial trials in the summer of 1942 demonstrated some early problems. The warhead proved unstable in flight, and it was difficult for the operator to obtain any accuracy as he had to fire the weapon at arm's length. Furthermore, the impact fuse was unreliable, failing to detonate when hitting the target at a steeper angle. A second version was produced, increasing the size of the propellant, the length of the tube, and inevitably the weight. It had also doubled in length to 70 centimetres, 27.6 inches, and now weighed 2.5 kilograms or 5.5 pounds. Importantly, the addition of a pop-out fins for the projectile when in flight removed the effect that spin had been having on the shape charge deployment. One of the key benefits of extending the launch tube was that the propellant burnt out in the tube. Wheeler realised that this feature would now allow the user to fire the weapon under their arm or over their shoulder, and as they were now not going to be singed or burnt by the exhaust propellant as the warhead left the tube. Additionally, a basic sighting vane was added to the launch tube to assist with aiming. Testing in November 1942 showed that it could now penetrate 140 millimetres at 30 metres, fulfilling the German Army Ordnance Department requirement that the weapon had to have a minimum effective range of no less than 30 to 40 metres, 100 to 130 feet. More refinements saw the Faust patrons being improved further with the incorporation of a new warhead based on the HA-3 magnetic grenade with pentalite filling, allowing it to penetrate 200 millimetres of armour at 30 metres. This development became known as the FP2. Production started in August 1943, with over 9 million being produced by the end of the war. It's at this stage that Adolf Hitler also takes an interest, and under his direction the name is subsequently changed to the more martial-sounding Panzerfaust, or Armour Fist, a reference to Gertz von Berlichingen and his Iron Fist, a German imperial knight made famous by an 18th century Goethe play. Consequently, the FP1 became the Panzerfaust 30 Klein, and the FP2 the Panzerfaust 30 Gross. The trials and user feedback also revealed a number of issues with the early Panzerfaust models, and key improvements started to be made. The first of these was to increase the range. This was achieved by adding more black propellant charge. This worked on the Panzerfaust 30 Gross and the new Panzerfaust 60, the numbers indicating the effective range. The development of the Panzerfaust 100 in 1944 took a different approach. To obtain the necessary distance, a new, thicker tube was required, but by using two separate launch charges in sequence with a split-second detonation gap, it was found that the projectile could reach targets up to 150 metres away without damaging the existing tube, so no lengthy redesign or retooling was required. Entering production in March 1945, the Panzerfaust 150 was the last production model. It involved having a complete redesign, having a new nose cone which increased its standoff distance, allowing better jet formation and penetration, plus its aerodynamic performance which gave it extended range out to 200 metres. It also featured a hand grip and a trigger handle fixed to the bottom of the tube. Unfortunately, production numbers for the 150 are difficult to confirm, but an order for 100,000 was issued in April 1945. The Panzerfaust 250 was a further evolution, but still in the development stages when the war ended. It would have extended the Panzerfaust range even further. German usage of the Panzerfaust is reflected in the monthly expenditure, with 200,000 Panzerfaust being expended each month from July 44 to October. Interestingly, the Germans backtrack on the disposal weapon idea, offering cigarette bonuses by March 1945 if any Panzerfaust 60 or Panzerfaust 100 launch tube was returned. They were supplied 4 to a box, with 1,000 being issued to the Panzer divisions and 1,500 to Panzer Grenadier divisions. The Germans also used bicycles to transport the Panzerfaust. This was not popular with the Panzerjäger, who preferred to have actual AFVs to carry them to the front line. The first record of Allied tank casualties to Panzerfaust weapons was in Italy, and by the spring of 1945 it had reached its high point. In the process of researching the extent of the Panzerfaust threat, it became clear that it's difficult to specifically distinguish between Panzerfaust attacks and Panzerschreck attacks from reading the war diaries, as the Royal Armoured Corps regiments tended to classify all German infantry anti-tank attacks as attack by bazooka. True, there are some exceptions, and some are clearly Panzerfausts, but most are hard to identify and would really need a first-hand account or post-battle field analysis measuring the diameter of the penetration on the armour to discern the source accurately. The majority of accounts show that when the terrain became close, i.e. woods, urban areas, etc., or ambushes from prepared positions such as foxholes, that this was where tank crews expected to be hit, and that there were accounts of tank crews not going down a wooded road without infantry support. Of course, the Germans were quick to use the propaganda potential of successful Panzerknackers, meaning tank buster or tank cracker, along with the award of the tank destroying badge for successful kills. The case of Heinrich Zubrod is worth repeating. In December 1944, around the Colmar Pocket, Zubrod of 189th Infantry Division was credited with knocking out 11 French Army tanks, for which he was awarded the Knight's Cross. He added another 2 to his tally in January, but was killed in action. The death of the Panzerfaust operator tends to be a theme, as the British Royal Armoured Corps accounts make clear. Again, any likely hiding place or position would generally be targeted to neutralise the possibility of a tank attack. The impact of the Panzerfaust threat on Allied tank forces can be seen by its effect on tactics and the scramble for add-on improvised armour. The first was already known. Tanks were less vulnerable in close terrain if they were supported by infantry. Stuart Hills makes this clear when he describes how the infantry walked in single file in front of the tanks as they moved through the bocage. This was opinion also held by US tank battalion commanders who, having suffered most of their initial post-D-Day tank losses due to enemy bazooka fire, felt that the only defence is close support from the infantry. For Red Army tank crews, fear of Panzerfaust attack saw infantry tank riders sit at the front of the tank ready to fire their submachine gun bursts at any Panzerfaust threat. Other measures were adopted too to counter the threat from these new anti-tank weapons, and improvised armour was quickly adopted by units in the field, which experienced the Panzerfaust threat in the Normandy bocage. By mid-July, 1st US Army tank units readying for Op Cobra and the Normandy breakout were improvising sandbag armour for their tanks. Given the logistics, this required engineer support for the bags and trucks for the sand to be transported from Omaha Beach. Sandbags appeared to have been fairly easy to place on the glacis plate, but required support for the sides. 743rd Tank Battalion solution was to use the existing screen shelf on their DD Shermans with the canvas screens removed and steel rods welded in place in order to support the sandbags. By early 1945, the Sherman's evident lack of armour protection saw 7th US Army start to weld steel cages to the hull and tow it on their tanks to hold sandbags for added protection. Patton was not a fan of sandbags, having been advised that they compromise weight whilst offering little added protection value. Consequently, 3rd US Army took an alternative route and added salvaged armour plate to up-armour their tanks. Other countermeasures tried were using jerry cans filled with sand to provide additional protection, and logs wired together and suspended from the hull sides. More technical measures were also developed, with plastic armour being trialled to combat the attack of shaped charges. The plastic armour was usually consisted of a mix of asphalt, concrete and aggregate such as quartz gravel and even sawdust, but it didn't see action as the war had ended already. 9th US Army also used sandbags, but they laid it over a layer of track plates, which was one of the main British and Commonwealth modifications, with some units reportedly attaching up to 150 tracks to their tank. The British also looked at protection trials in Italy and were examining different arrays of hexagonal wire suspended away from the tank to create a standoff. The Soviets famously looked at using mesh screens for their tanks for the assault on Berlin, the famous bed spring armour. But these were purpose-built frames with wire mesh rather than purloined German beds, and mounted around the 20 centimetres away from the armour and at an angle to protect them from Panzerfaust attacks from upper levels of buildings. Probably the strangest idea was the use of spikes to cover the whole of the tank, the idea being to stop the fuse from initiating. The photos make the tanks look like a pincushion and would have been interesting for the crew to access the tank itself or for the infantry to get near. Apparently they were effective against the Panzerfaust 30. Whether you were a veteran infantryman, an elderly Volksgrenadier, an eager Hitler youth or an old lady, it's clear that you would have benefited from reading the Panzerfaust Armour Fist instruction pamphlet before you picked up the weapon. The pamphlet's positive instructions were aimed to give you confidence as it exhorts the user that this Panzerfaust is their anti-tank gun and that it can shoot any tank up to 80 metres. There's no explanation as to how the shaped charge warhead works, but it makes the claim that it can penetrate through all known enemy tanks, even at the thickest part. To be fair, this wasn't an idle boast. If the Panzerfaust hit a tank and detonated it, it would be able to penetrate 20 centimetres of armour. Only a short period of practice is necessary to achieve high accuracy. Even a shoulder firing the weapon for the first time had only a few misses. British trials of Panzerfausts also tended to emphasise the number of duds that occurred. The propellant was susceptible to damp. which they found to be the problem. Moreover, the manufacturing process used forced labour from concentration camps to produce the Panzerfaust, which may have increased the chance of delivery faults through sabotage. Its post-war influence took a while to catch on, but it's heavily influenced the Soviet RPG series, and the similarities between the Panzerfaust 150 and 250 and the RPG-2 are striking. To summarise, in the Panzerfaust design, the Germans created a single-operator, disposable anti-tank weapon, which became the most dangerous and feared infantry anti-tank weapon of World War II. Produced in its millions, cheap to produce, easy to learn and simple to operate, the Panzerfaust gave young and old, military and civilian, the ability to knock out any enemy tank they met on the battlefield. Yes, it was prone to duds, and it still required nerve to accurately aim and fire, especially as it had a moving tank supported by infantry, but it finally provided a capability that the infantry had been looking for since the tank arrived on the battlefield: the ability for one individual to knock a tank out and survive the experience.